Alright, so we're back to this video about Margaret Sanger and Havelock Ellis sort of having a thing, or at the least, Margaret Sanger um, crushing on Havelock Ellis after his death, because that seems to be what's going on here. Anyways, I'm reading this over. Um, Margaret Sanger described him as Olympian on more than one occasion and referred to him as the king, only slightly in jest. Cerebral, withdrawn Henry Havelock Ellis, 1859 to 1939, more likely to be seen sunning his long, thin frame on his garden lawn than exerting his influence in any public sphere, was to Margaret Sanger and many feminists and sex reformers in the early 20th century a heroic presence. His writings on human sexuality eclipsed Freud's work in pre-World War I America and helped rouse a generation of women to fight for sexual autonomy. Ellis's 6-volume studies in the psychology of sex, published between 1897 and 1928 and widely publicized as a result of censorship battles in England, challenged accepted modes of sexual conduct and even the institution of marriage while advocating non-procreative sex as a natural and healthy human function. Ellis securely linked women's sexual liberation and pleasure to social stability, a belief that Sanger heralded, an equation that she recognized would necessarily require birth control. Clearly inspired by Ellis, Sanger sought him out in 1914 while in exile in England. They quickly became intimate friends and probably lovers, and began a rich correspondence that spanned 25 years without a prolonged interruption. In 1914, Ellis guided Sanger through historical and scientific publications on contraception. More significantly, he served as a constant source of intellectual support as Sanger expanded her crusade both ideologically and geographically. She, in turn, celebrated Ellis's life and achievements with the same zeal and devotion Boswell had to Johnson. She turned the birth control review over to tributes to Ellis every February to mark his birthday, instigated biographies and essays about him, dedicated much of her own work and several publications to him, and invoked his name in small-town newspaper interviews and at historical interventional conferences. From the mid-1920s until his death, she also gave him considerable financial assistance in the form of secretary's salary for his companion, teacher and translator Francos Lafayette Sion, and enough money to buy a small country house. Oh, that's nice. On July 17th, 1939, about 10 days after Ellis's death, Sanger met with her good friend, the singer and writer Dorothy Gordon. Quote, to pay tribute to Ellis on the national radio program. Let's talk it out over the interview has a stiff and simulated feel to it. Sanger mostly read from prepared text, even lifting passages verbatim from her second autobiography. She also exaggerates Ellis's mentoring role. He helped her at the British Library for a few weeks, not a year and a half, and she idealizes Ellis' complicated marriage to Edith Ellis, a lesbian who suffered severe bouts of depression. Nevertheless, the transcript does convey Sanger's affection and respect for Ellis and a good summation of her many tributes to him. It also marks the final time she defied him in public as a kind of Saint Francis of Assisi as sex psychologist. Following the posthumous release of Ellis' autobiography, My Life, in 1939, in which he revised the history of his marriage, already troubled when Ellis met Sanger and made worse by Edith's jealousy of her, by reducing his relationship with Sanger to an unremarkable and mildly intimate relationship. A wounded Sanger refrained from further hero worship. What follows is a complete version of the radio transcript as originally edited by Sanger, Gordon, or some other party. It is not clear who released the transcript. The original broadcast was slightly longer and survives on audio records in the Sanger collection and the Sophia Smith collection. Alright, announcer, let's talk over with Dorothy Gordon and Margaret Sanger. Announcer, having two such distinguished women on our program today leads me to believe the subject matter has some special significance. Uh, Dorothy Gordon. We feel it has, Miss Sanger, and I want to talk about the contributions that some individuals make to civilization. Announcer, who, for instance? Dorothy. I was thinking about Havelock Ellis particularly. We all know he has just passed out of this world. I say this world because his spirit lives on and will live on for all time. We are fortunate in having with us today someone who typifies, to me and to many others, that same deathless and timeless quality of the human spirit that was Havelock Ellis. I refer to Margaret Sanger, who is uniquely qualified to pay tribute to Havelock Ellis as one who knew and loved and understood him as few have been privileged to do. She has consented to share the knowledge with us and to tell us more about that great soul. May I ask you some questions, Margaret? Margaret. Certainly, Dorothy. Dorothy. When did you first meet Havelock Ellis? How did it happen? Margaret. It was Christmas Eve during the dark days of 1914. Many prominent people in England were anxious to learn about my battle with the Comstock laws. I had already begun my effort to construct a new world of my own dreams on the ideas of Havelock Ellis had put forth in his works. But to meet that great and universal mind was an unhoped for privilege. And then an invitation to call came for him. Dorothy. That must have been an interesting meeting. What happened? Margaret. Well, I climbed up the stairs to his apartment in a modest section of London, across the Thames, and full of shyness and fear and uncertainty, I lifted the huge brass knocker. Ellis himself opened the door. He seemed like a god. Oh my god. With his tall, slender figure and his great shock of white hair, his massive head, his wide expressive mouth, and deep-set eyes with their humorous twinkle, he welcomed me in. I stuttered with embarrassment, but Ellis was silent. I never knew a human being could be so silent and yet remain so poised. Small talk was not possible with him. You had to utter only the deepest truths within you. With his own hands, he prepared tea and toast and cakes, and we sat before a fire and talked and talked and talked. Dorothy. He wasn't difficult to talk to, was he? Margaret. No, indeed. After those first few moments, I felt as though I had always knew him. I began to realize then that the men who are truly great are the easiest to meet and understand. Havelock Ellis was entirely unaware of the eminence he had attained. He pasted no labels on himself, had no poses, made no efforts to impress. He was simply quite self-consciously what he was. Dorothy. Was he already well known at that time? Margaret. Yes, his work and fame in the field of sex psychology had already won him universal recognition, but he wasn't indifferent to applause and praise as he was to the abuse and criticism that previously had greeted his monumental works in England, forcing him to publish them in America. Like all great thinkers, Havelock was content to live simply in what many might consider poverty and obscurity. refusing to even consider the invitations that poured in upon him to tour and lecture in various countries that wished to honor his genius. Dorothy, what a contribution he made to humanity. Margaret, yes, there is no doubt that generations yet to come will honor him as one who opened the spiritual portals of the 20th century and revealed sex as a spiritual factor, as the lives of men and women, bringing to both alike a better understanding of their physical, mental, and creative functions. His labors, unique in history, raised this question from the obscurity and secrecy where it had been thrust for centuries, and lifted it to its proper plane of dignity and science. Nothing human was alien to his sympathy. His knowledge was broad and deep, his wisdom even deeper. He never made any strident, blatant attempt to cry aloud his message, but yet in ever increasing numbers men and women have paused to listen to his serene voice. Dorothy, but he, like yourself, had to face public abuse and criticism, didn't he? Margaret, yes, but here we see a phenomenon as amazing as radio. Despite all the obstacles and obstructions that hindered his expression, the legal battles and charges against him, his truth filtered through to minds ready to receive it. His philosophy, if it can be reduced to its essence, was that happiness must be the fruit of an attitude towards life, that it is in no way dependent upon the rewards of the gifts of fortune. Dorothy, you speak now of the great scientist and philosopher that he was. I feel that our audience would like to know more about Havelock Ellis, that his friends know him. Wasn't he exceedingly shy? Margaret, oh, very. Yet he loved the sauntering through the highways and byways, wherever people gather, but his shyness overtook him wherever he was noticed, and then, like a fawn in the dawn, he would quickly escape and be lost again. Dorothy, a fawn? That's interesting, because I remember his eyes that had soft look of a fawn. Yet, Margaret, yes, but don't forget that mischievous twinkle in them too, and his sense of humor, and his ever constant memory for the little things that please, the kinds of olives you liked, or the kind of bread or fruit you preferred, or the favorite dessert, which, by the way, Dorothy, he often made himself. Dorothy, with his usual simplicity? Margaret, yes. He was as much an artist in the kitchen as he excelled in other fields, and we all know that many a profound subject or problem was thought through him while he prepared some dish for a fortunate guest. Dorothy, you say he excelled in other fields? Meaning? Uh, Margaret, yes, he was not only a physician, he was also a poet and an artist, a philosopher, a sociologist, a psychologist, a scientist, embodying a combined knowledge of all these subjects in whatever he wrote or said. Dorothy, it interested me especially to see the great love that Havelock Ellis had in music and his knowledge of the masters in all the arts. Margaret, that is true. It was all an expression of his great understanding of humanity. He was a seeker after truth in all of its forms, and he welcomed it whenever he found it, believing that truth must be realized and recognized if we are to have a happier mankind. He wanted to set mankind free from the inhibitions, prejudices, and ignorance which have caused so many unnecessary hardships and suffering almost from the dawn of history. Dorothy, he was so shy and he loved people, didn't he? Margaret, yes, he loved the world and particularly the old and mellow things of life. He would roam and saunter about the old parts of Paris, and he especially loved Spain, with its old and winding streets, its people with their old customs, their folklore, and their joyous dancing. That was why you, Dorothy, with your merry impersonations of these songs and dances, struck such a sympathetic chord with him. His book, The Soul of Spain, remains one of his best ever written about that now unhappy country. Dorothy. Yes, that was a wonderful book, and also his Dance of Life. He was such a prolific and such a varied writer. How could one man accomplish such? Uh, how could one man accomplish in so much in a lifetime? Margaret, because he did not scatter his ideas and energies as most of us do, but captured them as they were created. Dorothy, how did he capture them? Margaret, he carried a little notebook, and regardless of where we were, whether in the streetcar walking together or in a restaurant, he would suddenly stop to jot down his ideas or impressions, later storing them away in little envelopes. By the time the envelopes became too bulky for comfort, the book had emerged. Dorothy, there's your sense of humor. One of the things that Havelock Ellis loves about you. So, so was your laughter. In fact, one of the greatest compliments I have ever received in my life was to have him say that I remind him of you, because I too laughed a lot with him. But tell me, Margaret, you met Havelock Ellis in 1914. American women did not have the vote then. You were an ardent feminist. What was his attitude towards votes for women and feminism? Margaret. Havelock Ellis helped to usher in a new day of womankind. To all of his great gifts as scientific investigator, philosopher, thinking, poet, and literacy artist combined in one, was added a peculiarity, sympathetic insight into the nature and needs of women. He threw the weight of his vast knowledge and influence into advancing the cause of women's freedom, and to women everywhere he seemed a heaven sent liberator. But he believed wholeheartedly in a 50-50 give and take basis, and that women were as equal to men as men were to men in all of our relationships. There was never any catering, any inference that women belonged to the so-called weaker sex or that they were inferior in any way. He believed that women should pay for their own requirements through the efforts of their own minds and brains, just as men do. Unless I was especially invited to lunch, unless I was especially invited to lunch or dinner with him, I never imposed, but always paid my own share of expenses, whether for car fare, in a restaurant, or for a taxi. Dorothy, that reminds me of our mutual friend who wanted to lunch with Havelock regularly. Tell us the story. You know the one I mean. Margaret, oh yes, this friend wanted to set a certain day once a week or once every 2 weeks to lunch together in London with Havelock, just to keep that close contact of the mind. But Ellis replied that anything of the spirit could not be hedged in by the limitations of time and days in the week. He would rather have their meetings a spontaneous desire and a spontaneous joy than a regulated duty. Well, that's true, Dorothy. Well, with ideas like those, what did he think about marriage? Did he believe in that? Margaret. Most certainly, but he was wise enough to know that if a marriage is to remain strong, there must be freedom. Freedom for both individuals, the man and the woman, in order to attain his freedom and to keep his own identity and to allow his wife, Edith, to develop along her own lines. They maintained two households. He had an apartment in London, she lived on a farm and made farming pay. Dorothy, tell us something about Miss Ellis. Edith Ellis was vivacious, charming, energetic woman with a mind of her own, practical and capable as well. She ran this farm in Cornwall, but had always ready a suit of rooms for her husband. There she kept his special books, his special clothes, and personal belongings, and flowers, blooming and fresh always, in his room, where he was free to go and come any time that he wished. On the other hand, he kept a suite of rooms for her in his apartment in the city, with their special city and evening clothes, her special books and flowers and cheery fire ever ready to greet her. They believed that the way to keep their love alive in marriage was to be ever alert in the little things, courtesies, considerations, and to continuously woo each other as they did in courtship. It was a beautiful friendship, a continuing courtship until her death in 1916. He believed he lived what he believed. His principles and theories were put into practice, and they worked. Dorothy, Havelock Ellis influenced you in your own special work a great deal, did he not? Margaret, oh yes, he guided my early studies and directed my reading for a year and a half in that famous historical spot, the British Museum. Regularly each day we met in a reading room and he mapped out lines of study for me to follow. He believed so strongly in my case that he wanted to see me avoid all possible mistakes. I never felt about any person as I do about Havelock Ellis. I developed a reverence and affection and a love with having strength which have strengthened with the years. To have known him has been a bounteous privilege. To claim him my friend and the greatest honor of my life. Dorothy, I am great how I am grateful that through you, Margaret, I also had the privilege of meeting that great spirit. The world will miss him, and we miss his friends. Very feel very sad. Is there anything that can help to make his loss and little loss poignant? Margaret, yes. We who loved him must be grateful that he had been released from the increasing pain and physical limitations of these latter years, that he had made the world infinitely richer by the presence in it, that he had become part of the heritage of all of mankind, and lastly, we can draw strength and courage and inspiration from his own sublime statement, written to a friend during an almost fatal illness some years ago. He wrote, quote, I find I remain serene, even cheerful. For some years past I have accommodated my arrangements to death and guided my activities accordingly, even though I may not yet have completed everything I planned of my day's work in the world. My faith has carried me so far and will accompany me to the end. Death is the final master and lord, but death must await my good pleasure. I command death because I have no fear of death, but only love. And so it proved the cable that came to me from Madame Francocion, that dear and devoted friend who was with him when he died, read, quote, Havelock passed on quietly Saturday night. It was beautiful. Um, Dorothy, yes, the passing of Havelock Ellis was as beautiful as his living. Thank you, Margaret Sanger, for bringing us your lovely memories of him. They will live on just as he and you will both live on in the lives of generations to come. Alright. Well, that was cute and sweet. And this might not matter too much, or it might matter. I think this is important personally. Um, Even if you are trying to help someone, and even if you are doing it in good faith and through the context of eugenic times, even, you know, you could be thoughtful, you could just be putting empathy into whatever you're doing, it could still lead to mass harm. And I could just start rambling about family planning and eco planning, uh, population bomb nonsense. But even if Havelock Ellis and Margaret Sanger were doing this in good faith and it wasn't malicious, it certainly turned out that way. Um, we can pretty much see it now, like the foundations of discrimination and um, brainstorming of fertility and homosexuality are all coming to light, at least currently, again. Um, Alright, I will be back.